The results are in, and like it or not, COP28 is over for this year, and we're looking forward to COP29, kind of, sort of. The major headline coming out of COP28 is that countries have agreed to phase out fossil fuels, but there's not much beyond that. So we're going to talk about that on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And today we're going to be talking about action and more news about supposed action. COP28, the Convention of Parties 28 that was happening in the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, has finished. It finished on Wednesday, December 12th, and there are some results. And I found it quite interesting, some of these results. And I went to The Independent to look at, some of these results. And there were five key takeaways from this year's Climate Change Summit. And some of them were potentially historic moments, but there's still plenty of work to be done. But just before we get into that, this episode is brought to you by Conservation Careers. Conservation Careers is a great platform to figure out what you want to do within your career in conservation. You can take courses. You can find out get access to jobs, find out what you need to get those jobs. And I'm actually taking a communications for conservation course right now, and it's fantastic. I really love it. It's very intuitive. There's help. I'm hoping to move towards a communication job eventually within conservation, and I'm very happy to be able to be a part of this community because it is a community. It's a supportive community. It's got an app that's really accessible. You can watch the videos on the app, and you can get access to this program for 33% off. So just go to conservation-careers.com to get full access to these courses, and just put in when you're going to the checkout, just put in SUFB. That's SUFB. So it stands for Speak Up for Blue, to get 33% off and join the marine field in your new career, whether you're switching careers, whether you're starting a new one, whether you're building on your careers. Go to conservation-careers.com and just put in SUFB at the checkout, and you should be able to have access. All right, let's move on. Now, COP28, always interesting. A lot of controversy surrounded by this one. Why? Because it was done in the UAE, one of the largest oil producers in the world, home of OPEC, and which is like the governing body that manages the flow of oil throughout the world, and has a lot of power. And so there was concern that there were fossil fuel companies that were going to be there, that were going to lobby groups and countries to be able to increase production of oil and gas. There was problems. They're saying the president, who was in charge of COP, not only was in charge of the renewable energy for the UAE, but was also in charge and president or chief executive officer of the oil production company in the UAE. So there was a lot of controversy around that. There were some terms that the president said he doesn't think, or the science doesn't really indicate, that you can phase out fossil fuels. There were leaked documents that may or may not have been leaked, or may not have been real, that the countries were going, or the oil and gas companies were going to speak to a certain number of countries, about 13 countries, to discuss oil production in that country and in those countries, and an increase of oil production. So there's a lot of controversy going around that in these climate talks, which we know is the reason why we're having these climate talks, is because of the fossil fuel industry, right? We really know that the burning of fossil fuels has created the situation that we're in, or is mostly created for the situation that we're in. So I wanted to go through there's a lot goes on at COP28. There are a lot of side deals, there are a lot of meetings, there are a lot of panel discussions, there's a lot of stuff that goes on. And I wanted to kind of go over some of the key takeaways, so that when people ask, what happens at COP28 anyway? Some of the key takeaways that have happened, and then I wanted to talk about a small thing that happened just from when I was talking to somebody that I think was kind of pretty cool. So let's go with the key main takeaways, the 5 key takeaways. The first one is it the end of fossil fuels? Are we really going to see that? So in the 3 decades that they've done climate negotiations at COP, they have previously failed to make any kind of mention of the root cause of climate change. So burning of fossil fuels, which has driven emissions to cause climate change, have never really been mentioned. A couple of years ago, they did talk about ending coal, the coal industry and phasing out the coal industry, but that's the closest it's ever been to fossil fuels. But this time, there's finally, as nations seek to keep a goal of limiting the average global heating to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels within reach. With 2023 set to be the hottest year humans have ever experienced, there is also a symbolism to it as happening. It says it's embarrassing that it took 28 years, but now we finally hear. Now it finally seems like the world has acknowledged that we need to move away from fossil fuels. This is Dan Jorgensen from Denmark's climate minister. He said after the final deal was passed. So more than 130 countries, as well as scientists and climate change activists groups, have urged for the inclusion of explicit commitment to phase out or even phase down the use of fossil fuels. So the deal is not perfect by any means. But one thing is clear. This is a quote from the UN Environment Program, Inger Andersen. The world is no longer denying our harmful addiction to fossil fuels, right? So just by acknowledging, saying, you know what, countries agree we need to start phasing out fossil fuels, or it is suggested that we phase out fossil fuels. The wording here is really non-committal, right? However, it's a big step forward to say, you know what? We actually know that fossil fuels are the problem, and we're actually putting that in writing. We're actually acknowledging it to the world community to say fossil fuels is the problem, and we need to start phasing out or phasing down, whatever that means, fossil fuels. So some people think Anne Rasmussen of Samoa, speaking on behalf of all small islands, told the world leaders after the deal was agreed, it is not enough for us to reference the science and then make agreements that ignore what the science is telling us what we need to do. So the UN climate chief, Simon Steele, said he saw this agreement as a floor, not a ceiling, calling for stronger targets in the future. That is not the key. It is now up to nations to take the most ambitious interpretation of the statement to cut emissions. So now it's going to be essentially a race to see which country can show off the most by cutting the most emissions, right? By acknowledging that fossil fuels is the problem, right? And even though there's a non-commitment sentence around that, we're still acknowledging globally that fossil fuels is the problem. So there are countries that can make a lot of headway by cutting those emissions. Okay, so that was the first key takeaway, a big key takeaway, and it's probably the headline you're going to see the most. I don't want you to get confused by the fact that it's saying countries agree or COP28 agrees to phase out climate change. It's agree to suggest that countries start thinking about phasing out, fossil fuels to receive or to do something about climate change. That's really the statement, and that's what you really need to take into context. There are a lot of countries that are going to just say, well, we don't really need to do that. There's a lot of heads of nations that are going to be like, well, we don't really need to do that, because let's be honest, it's going to be more difficult to do that, especially for countries like Canada, like the US, like a lot of countries where the oil and gas industry is pretty much intertwined with government, right, in terms of support of a lot of representatives. And so you see it. Like, the hypocrisy is not even being hidden anymore. You really just see it with a lot of politicians these days. But that, it's still hopeful. I'm still trying to be optimistic, although there's reasons why not to be optimistic. So anyway, that's where I wanted to take it for that first key takeaway. The second key takeaway is corporate COP28. So there were a record number of attendees linked to the fossil fuel industry at the summit. Some 2,456, according to analysis by climate groups. So the COP28 president, the Sultan Ahmad Al-Jaber, CEO of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, ran into a series of controversies before the summit and its opening days. More than 130 legislators from the US and EU had called for his removal ahead of the talks, and then he had to say that he and the UAE were very much respect climate science to quell a backlash of over comments questioning the need to phase out fossil fuels. So there were a lot of questions to the Sultan about why he's the president, why he shouldn't be removed, why he should be the president. He has done, I did an episode on this earlier on him, and he has done a lot of deals to get renewable energies going, although he's also got a lot of deals to expand oil and gas, so production and exploration. So, it goes hand in hand. However, he did say that we need to bring in the fossil fuel industry to start talking to those companies because they're being involved. And if they're outside of the phase-out talks, maybe they're not going to be interested in doing those at all, right? So I think it'll be really interesting. Also, some of the things that Mr. Jabber said suggested that there was no science behind it requiring the end of fossil fuels in order to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, a key aim in the fight against the climate crisis. So, there's a lot of things that, we'll do. But he did lead the climate summit to its conclusion. He said, we will be leaving Dubai with our heads held high, saying after he passed the deal. So, there's also a lot of that. However, states such as Saudi Arabia push to include language about carbon capture and utilization of storage into the final agreement, allowing fossil fuel production to continue and emissions being trapped and buried. Now, this is dangerous. This is dangerous because we know in Canada there was just a report saying that the technology is not there to capture enough carbon compared to the emissions that are being put out by the fossil fuel industry. So what a lot of the fossil fuel industry is doing is like, hey, we can continue production because we're going to capture most of that carbon, so you don't have to worry about increased greenhouse gas emissions. But a lot of the reports that are coming out of Canada saying, well, we can't do that right now. The technology is just not there, and we need to ensure that the technology is there before we even think about doing carbon capture. And then we need to reduce the emissions. So that's what we're talking about here. So you have to really take it with a grain of salt in this situation, which is most of the stuff that comes out of COP28, including the key takeaway number 3, another fund without enough money. So the summit kicked off by putting into action what COP27 put on paper. So the Loss and Damage Fund. This was a big fund. This was a big deal. And it aimed at helping poor nations to cope with the impact of the climate crisis. So we all know that small island states and poor nations like developing countries are having problems, dealing with climate change adaptations. Some islands had to be completely moved, or like the people on there had to move because their islands were disappearing due to sea level rise, right? Other islands were getting massive storms. We saw what happened with Maui, even though it's part of the U.S. That was a huge, devastating loss. Plus, the money to cope with that is really difficult to do. And we've been talking about having a fund that developed countries, developed nations that are producing most of the carbon dioxide emissions can actually, or even just methane emissions as well, greenhouse gas emissions, can actually contribute to this loss and damage fund. So at the start of the summit, Mr. Jabber said he did not just want to set up the fund, but for nations to fill it. Countries made pledges during the 2 weeks of talks, putting $790 million that has been raised for the fund. Not even 1% of that of what studies suggest is needed. So it's not a lot of money, with the estimates of the cost ranging from $100 billion to more than $400 billion. I should mention that this fund, the UAE is not obliged to put in the fund, which I thought was interesting because that's who Mr. Jabber actually represents. So you'd think that they would lead by example. But getting richer nations to pledge some of the funds has been one of the biggest challenges in recent years. We've heard some of the presidents in the past, right, for the U.S., including Donald Trump, saying, why should we pay for other people's problems? Why should we put in funds for that? So depending on who your leader is and the governing body that's in place, the party, you may not get that money. There's no obligation for those countries to do it other than leading by example. So you might have some countries who are putting in more money than others because they're trying to show that they're trying to do something, right? They're making a race so that they can help with the planet. That's what they're trying to do. The decision to move away from fossil fuels also points in one clear direction. Developing countries, which have very little to do with the crisis, need money to transition to renewables. Adaptation is really a life and death issue, said Bangladesh climate envoy Saber Hossain Chowdhury. I apologize if I butchered that name. We cannot compromise on adaptation. We cannot compromise on lives and livelihoods. And he's right? We have a problem in this world. All the forest fires, all the floods, all the massive hurricanes, these could kill people. These are killing people. And so it's life and death. It's livelihoods as well, right? And, when you lose businesses because of a fire or a flood, that's dangerous in the long term. So the 6 countries that pledged to the new funding at the Green Climate Fund, so established to help developing nations, Australia, Estonia, Italy, Portugal, Switzerland, and the U.S. put in $3.5 billion. Another $188 million was also pledged to the Adaptation Fund. But the coffers still remain low. A recent UN report said finance for adaptation needed to reach $194 billion to $366 billion per year. That's a lot of money to put in when a lot of countries are really having trouble with money right now. All right, the fourth key takeaway: renewables are on the rise. So the summit has made one thing clear: renewables are the future, and they are set to become the primary sources of energy in the coming decades. So the final deal called for countries to triple their renewable energy capacity by 2030. So solar and wind energy use and infrastructure has already been expanding at rapid speed, and prices have dropped. So this is good. We can actually continue to do that. The U.S. is doing it. Canada is doing it. A lot of places around the world are doing it. And COP28 has sent a clear signal to the markets that renewables are the future, and more investments will be in that sector. So even though progress is lauded by many, climate groups also said that the language on renewables should be strengthened at future summits. So again, every meeting, this is why they meet every year, and I'm glad that they do, because they keep building on these. And this happens a lot when we talk about conservation. Is like, say you add a marine protected area. It may not be the best marine protected area, but you've defined the boundaries, and the management structure around it may not be the best. It may not be the strongest. But over the years, once you've established the boundaries, which is probably the hardest part, then you can start putting in the management. Like the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park increased its no-take reserve area by 33%, 30 years after it was established, because it did a study with fishermen, and it found, with the fishing community, it found out that, hey, these areas, you guys don't fish in these areas, and we want to increase these. Can we increase them? Yeah, for sure. We don't go in these areas. Boom, 33% increase in no-take areas in the Great Barrier Reef, or at the turn of the century. Great, right? This is something that is huge that can happen. So hopefully every year we build on these set of language, these set of statements, and that we can get stricter and stricter every time. So that's why I'm not completely disappointed by that first statement about phasing out or phasing down the fossil fuel industry, or suggestion of phasing down the fossil fuel industry. It's a start. All right, and the final key takeaway: another deal reached on who will host COP29. I thought they would figure this out a year or two in advance, but apparently they haven't. But this year, a geopolitical gridlock left the conference without a successor. It was supposed to be Europe's turn in 2024, but Russia vowed to veto any country's bid to host the summit, as most of the continent has lined up to condemn Moscow's near 2-year invasion of the Ukraine. So this is where politics get into play. So it can't have something in Europe because of the European Union and their stance against Russia. So Russia's like, no, I'm going to veto this, and I have veto powers. So forget that. So finally on Saturday, just 3 days before the official end of COP28, this gridlock was broken, and Azerbaijan, another oil producer, was officially selected as the next host. So another controversy that we're going to see. And I want to know from you, do you find that if we are sitting in countries that are major oil producers, will we get the engagement that we want? Will we get the stakeholders that we want? Do we have fossil fuels attention? Are they going to be there, and are they going to be talking about oil and gas expansion or oil and gas phasing out? I would love to hear your thoughts on it. True thoughts. Just hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. Or if you're in our Facebook, I have a Facebook group chat for the Speak Up for Blue community. And so if you're in that community, join the chat. I put out invites a while ago. You can join the chat. I'd love to hear your opinion on that. So please feel free to do that. However, soon after the decision was announced, climate groups pointed out the concerns of the Baku's human rights record. So Azerbaijan doesn't have a good human rights record. So both UAE and COP27 host Egypt face similar questions. So when you have it on all these different countries, whether they're oil producers or not, there's a lot of there's a lot of things that go on to a host country, and there's a reason why certain countries will host it more than once. And the new countries that are hosting it, they're going to be put under a microscope, and they're going to be, just like the UAE, you're going to get politics come ahead. You're going to get oil and gas involvement coming into a head. Azerbaijan's going to be the same thing. Human rights, oil production country, where you're going to hear a lot of controversy. People are going to be like, you know what, these talks are not worth anything. We're already at 29, going on 29, and we haven't really seen a lot done, but we have seen some stuff done. Right. And it's not always in the key takeaways. And I was just having a quick conversation in that chat that I was just talking to you about, the Facebook group chat. And somebody mentioned that, a group from Belize struck a deal with the funding agency, an investor, to develop seagrass and mangrove complexes, habitats, essentially, in unison in Belize. So, there are a lot of side deals that are going on. There are a lot of, just like any conference, when you go to a meeting, you go to a conference, you'll have like sort of the main negotiators that are, talking about these key elements, right? These key takeaways. But then there's a lot of side deals going on. And some of them could be good for climate, some of them could be bad for climate. I have a friend who's a CEO of an energy company, like a sustainable energy company, that's working with buildings in Toronto to make these massive buildings more environmentally friendly and more sustainable and almost like net zero. Right? They just did a major hotel that is now converted to being more sustainable. Those are huge things. They were at the meeting, talking to different investors, exchanging ideas and collaborating with other companies and stakeholders. And so there are a lot of people who are going to those meetings, and they're seeing that. Now, some people that I've heard that went to the meetings were completely just exhausted from just the talk and just the BS that goes on there. And I'm sure there's a lot of negativity that goes on. But there's also some positive things that come out of these meetings. And I'll be honest, like you've heard me talk about COP before. I'm not a huge fan of it, but these talks need to happen. These small building blocks, even though they're not fast enough, not aggressive enough, still have to happen. We need this to happen as a world thing, as a global entity. We need to approach this together. And to be able to do that, we have to put up with the BS that happens at these meetings, right? And we're not going to get every result that we want, even though we should have had it a long time ago. So those are my thoughts on COP, just based on the independent from what the key takeaways. So I thank you for that. And of course, some of the friends and some of the posts that I've seen before. I'm going to put all those resources into the show notes so you can check that out. Don't forget, if you are looking to get into the career of conservation, marine conservation, or any other conservation, please feel free to go to conservation.careers.com and you can get access to getting your career on the go. 33% off. Just put in SUFB at checkout when you join the program or you join a course. And if you're in that course and you joined it from me, please let me know you're in there. Or if you're listening to this and you're part of Conservation Careers and you see my name, just give me a shout out. I'd love to hear from you. But thank you so much. Also, you can hit me up on Instagram, DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. But thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of How to Protect the Ocean. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.